Chapter 1: The night the streets breathed blood. The metallic taste of fear clung to the air long before the knife appeared. A narrow alley off Bucks Row. Cobblestones slick with last night's rain. The gas lamps flickered like tired witnesses, their yellow light trembling against brick walls stained by decades of neglect. Somewhere nearby, water dripped in a slow, patient rhythm. One drop. Then another. As if the street itself was counting down. She laughed first. It was a brittle sound. Too loud. The kind of laughter meant to convince both men that the night was still under control. Her boots scraped the stones as she shifted her weight, pulling her shawl tighter. Cheap wool. Damp. Smelling of gin and cold sweat. He stood close enough that she could feel his breath. Not rushed. Not drunk. Calm, almost courteous. The kind of man you wouldn't remember 5 minutes later. Dark coat. Clean cuffs. Gloves pulled tight, as if London itself were something contagious. Then the alley exhaled. A sharp intake of breath. Her body stiffened. Not a scream yet, just confusion. The blade slid with practiced certainty, cold metal meeting warm skin. The sound was not dramatic. No thunder. Just a wet, intimate whisper, like tearing fabric that didn't belong to you. Blood touched the stones. It spread quickly, dark and eager, filling the shallow grooves between cobbles worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The smell arrived a second later, iron and sewage, life mixing with the city's permanent rot. Somewhere, a door slammed. Somewhere else, laughter continued, blissfully unaware. He knelt. Not in panic. Not in haste. This was the moment he had been waiting for. His gloved hands moved with deliberate precision, almost reverence. The city gave him cover. London always did. Too many alleys. Too many forgotten women. Too many people trained to look away. Her eyes searched his face. There was no hatred there. No pleasure either. Just focus. As if she were a problem to be solved, not a person to be mourned. Her mouth opened, forming a word that never made it out. The sound died in her throat, swallowed by the fog. A carriage rattled past the end of the street. Hoofs struck stone. Wood creaked. A driver coughed. Life, uninterrupted. London had schedules to keep and sins to ignore. When it was over, he stood and adjusted his coat. A small splash of red marked the cuff. Annoying. He wiped it carefully with a handkerchief, folding the cloth with the kind of care usually reserved for love letters or church programs. For a moment, he listened. No footsteps. No shouts. No sirens, those were for the future. Only the city breathing around him, heavy and indifferent. Whitechapel did not judge. Whitechapel recorded nothing. It absorbed secrets the way the Thames swallowed refuse. He stepped away from the body without looking back. Behind him, she lay twisted at an unnatural angle, skirts bunched, hair plastered to her face by mist and blood. Another woman whose name would matter only for a day. Another life reduced to a headline, then a footnote, then silence. The gas lamp flickered again. A cat appeared at the far end of the alley, sniffed the air, and froze. Even animals knew when to keep their distance. After a moment, it turned and vanished into the dark, choosing hunger over curiosity. Minutes passed. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps. A man late for work. A woman clutching her basket. A glance. A pause. A sharp inhale. The first scream tore through the fog like a blade of its own. By morning, the street would be crowded. Police boots trampling evidence. Reporters sharpening pencils. Neighbors offering theories with the confidence of people who had slept safely in their beds. By noon, the city would move on. But somewhere between that first drop of blood and the rising sun, something fundamental had shifted. Not because a woman had died, London was accustomed to that, but because someone had discovered how easy it was. And because the streets, for the first time, had learned a new name for fear. They just didn't know it yet. Chapter 2, a question that should never be asked. By the time dawn reached Whitechapel, the alley no longer belonged to the dead. Police boots churned the damp stones into mud. Uniforms crowded the narrow space, their wool coats steaming faintly in the cold morning air. Someone gagged. Someone else joked, too loudly, as if humor could disinfect what lay at their feet. It couldn't. The body had been covered now. A sheet. Thin. Inadequate. It fluttered slightly when the wind slipped down the alley, tracing the outline of what everyone pretended not to see. A woman. Middle-aged. Poor. Conveniently nameless to most of them. A constable nudged the edge of the cloth with his boot. Another one, he muttered, already bored. Another one. As if she were a broken bottle or a dead rat pulled from a cellar. The city produced bodies the way factories produce smoke, constantly, predictably, and without reflection. A small crowd gathered at the mouth of the street. Dockworkers. Shopkeepers. Women with sharp eyes and tighter mouths. They leaned forward, hungry for details. Horror was a kind of breakfast in Whitechapel. Cheap and filling. Did she fight? Someone asked. Always do, came the reply, spoken with a shrug. A journalist arrived late, breathless, notebook already open. He sniffed the air and frowned, disappointed by the lack of spectacle. Blood had been washed away. The worst of it gone. Violence, like news, was best when it was fresh. He scribbled anyway. Woman found murdered. Early hours. Suspected robbery. Local disturbance. Safe words. Comfortable lies. The kind that allowed everyone to return to work without changing their route home. But the doctor lingered. He crouched beside the body, lifting the sheet just enough to see what the others missed, or chose to ignore. His jaw tightened. This was not clumsy. This was not drunk. The cut spoke a language he recognized all too well. Strange, he murmured. The inspector looked over. A tired man with a permanent crease between his eyebrows and hands that smelled of ink and tobacco. What is? The doctor hesitated. He knew better than to alarm people before breakfast. The precision, he said finally. There's intent here. The inspector snorted. There's always intent when someone picks up a knife. That was the end of it. Or it should have been. By midday, the story had already begun to change. In the pubs, the murder grew teeth. In the markets, it grew a face. By evening, it had a personality. Someone swore they'd seen a well-dressed gentleman near the alley. Someone else insisted it was a foreigner. Another blamed the women themselves. Wrong place. Wrong hour. Wrong life. Blame was cheap. Fear was not. That night, doors were locked earlier than usual. Women walked faster, eyes fixed ahead, fingers wrapped around whatever could be used as a weapon. Men joked about it, nervously. Men always joked when they were afraid of becoming irrelevant to the story. And above it all hovered a question no one wanted to ask out loud. What if this wasn't an accident? What if it wasn't a crime of opportunity? What if someone had done this not out of desperation, but choice? The city rejected the idea immediately. London was the center of the world. Empire. Progress. Gaslight and order. Monsters belonged in fairy tales, not in alleys behind respectable streets. Yet even as people laughed it off, something subtle shifted. A tightening in the chest. A pause before turning a corner. A thought quickly buried beneath routine. Somewhere, not far from where the body had been found, a man washed his hands carefully. He scrubbed beneath his nails. Dried his skin. Folded his coat. He moved through his rooms with quiet efficiency, stepping around furniture as if everything were exactly where it should be. Because it was. Outside, church bells rang. A call to order. To morality. To the comforting idea that someone was in control. He listened, unimpressed. The bells had rung before. They would ring again. They always rang after violence, never before. That was the joke of it. A cosmic sense of timing that would have been funny, if anyone were laughing. He poured himself a drink. Clear. Strong. He raised the glass, not in celebration, but acknowledgement. The city had noticed. Not him, yet, but the shape he left behind. And that was enough. Because once a city starts asking the wrong questions, it rarely likes the answers. And London was just beginning to wonder. Chapter 3, Whitechapel, where God forgot to look. Whitechapel did not wake up. It endured. Morning light crept in reluctantly, diluted by smoke and fog, sliding along brick walls blackened by decades of coal and neglect. The streets smelled of rotten survival, spoiled vegetables, horse manure, cheap soap, and the sour breath of overcrowded rooms where sleep was a rumor, not a habit. This was the part of London that brochures never mentioned. Children played barefoot near open drains, their laughter sharp and brittle, like glass ready to break. Women lined up outside lodging houses clutching a single coin, knowing it bought them a bed only if they arrived early, and if no one stronger pushed them aside. Men drifted between factories and pubs, faces gray with exhaustion, hope worn thin from overuse. A few streets away, silk curtains were being drawn back by servants. Silverware clinked. Tea steamed. The empire stretched and yawned, unaware, or pretending to be, that its foundation rested on places like this. Whitechapel was not poor by accident. It was poor by design. Here, faith hung crooked on the walls of missions and churches, offered like a bargain no one could afford to believe in. Preachers spoke of salvation while stepping carefully around bodies asleep on the pavement. God, it seemed, had outsourced this neighborhood. And women paid the price. They moved through the streets with practiced awareness, eyes always scanning, minds calculating. Which alley was shorter? Which client looked too sober? Which promise sounded like a lie, and which sounded like hunger? Their names changed often. Their value did not. The newspapers called them unfortunate. The police called them inevitable. At night, Whitechapel transformed. Gas lamps cast long, distorted shadows, turning ordinary men into looming figures and doorways into mouths that looked ready to swallow you whole. Pubs spilled noise and smoke onto the streets. Gin was cheap. Memory was cheaper. It was in these hours that the city exhaled its secrets. Behind thin walls, arguments ended in fists. In rooms rented by the hour, dignity was traded for warmth. Laughter floated out of windows, too loud, too forced, defiance masquerading as joy. And somewhere within this chaos, someone was paying very close attention. He watched how people moved. How they avoided eye contact. How no one asked questions after dark. Whitechapel had rules, even if it pretended not to. Don't intervene. Don't linger. Don't care too much. Sympathy was a liability here. Curiosity could get you killed, or worse, noticed. The police presence was performative at best. A patrol here. A whistle there. Just enough to say something was being done, not enough to change anything. Authority walked these streets like a guest who didn't plan to stay long. In the papers, crime was discussed with a kind of detached fascination. Numbers. Patterns. Moral decay. Editorials blamed drink, immigration, loose women, anything except the city itself. Anything except the comfortable truth that Whitechapel existed because it was useful. Useful as a warning. Useful as a dumping ground. Useful as a place where lives could disappear quietly. By the end of that first week, the murder was already fading from conversation. New scandals. New tragedies. The machine needed fresh fuel. But fear lingered. It crept into small habits. Doors bolted sooner. Shared rooms chosen over solitude. Women pairing up, pretending it was for company, not survival. Men walking behind them noticed the tension and misunderstood it. Some laughed. Some leered. Some felt offended, as if fear were a personal insult. Irony had a sense of humor like that. Because while Whitechapel had always been dangerous, it had never been personal. Violence here was random. Democratic. Anyone could be unlucky. Now, there was the unsettling possibility of intent. Someone choosing. Someone deciding who mattered least. And in a district built on the idea that no one mattered at all, that was a terrifying upgrade. The city did not know it yet, but it had just provided the perfect hiding place. Not for a beast. For a man. And men, history had shown, were always harder to catch. Chapter 4, the first body no one wanted to claim. They found her just before dawn, when the night was tired but the city wasn't ready to forgive it yet. She lay on her back, skirts hitched awkwardly, boots still on. One arm stretched out as if reaching for something that had moved just out of range. The other bent beneath her, fingers stiff, nails rimmed with grime that would never wash away now. Her face was turned slightly to the side, eyes half open, staring at a brick wall that had seen worse and learned to forget faster. No purse. No witnesses. No hurry. The constable who discovered her stood there longer than regulations required, not out of respect but confusion. There was something about the stillness that felt wrong. Death was common in Whitechapel, but this had a certain deliberateness. Like a sentence, carefully punctuated. When the others arrived, the routine began. A whistle. A notebook. A sigh. They asked the same questions they always asked, already knowing the answers. Name. Unknown. Address. Likely none worth writing down. Occupation. The pause here was longer. Someone cleared his throat. A look passed between two men who pretended not to understand each other. Unfortunate, the inspector finally said, and wrote it down as if it explained everything. A doctor knelt beside the body, lifting the chin gently, professionally. He noted the wounds with a frown that deepened as he worked. This was not rage. This was not sloppiness. The cuts were placed with intention, confidence. Someone who knew exactly where to put the blade, and why. He straightened slowly. This wasn't robbery, he said. The inspector glanced up. There's no money. There was no struggle, the doctor replied. Not the kind you'd expect. Silence followed. The kind that fills space when no one wants to be the first to say something inconvenient. A small crowd had formed by now, pressing closer despite repeated shouts to move back. Faces strained forward, hungry and nervous. Someone crossed themselves. Someone else spat. A woman in a faded shawl stared too hard, as if trying to recognize the dead without daring to admit she might. She was Mary, someone whispered. Or Annie. Or Elizabeth. Names floated through the air, unanchored, interchangeable. No one was sure. No one wanted to be. The body was lifted onto a stretcher with careful hands that had done this before. It was lighter than expected. That detail bothered one of the younger officers more than it should have. He said nothing. By the time the wagon rolled away, the street already felt emptier than it had any right to. As if something essential had been removed along with the corpse. The newspapers arrived late and left early. Their headlines were cautious, almost bored. A woman found dead. Circumstances unclear. Police investigating. A small column, tucked between advertisements for soap and spectacles. Tragedy, neatly contained. Inside the station, the report was filed and set aside. There were other cases. Louder ones. Men with connections. Crimes that embarrassed the right people. This was Whitechapel. Women died here. It was practically a feature. And yet. That evening, the doctor reread his notes. He lingered on the angles. The placement. The absence of chaos. Something about it gnawed at him, a professional itch that wouldn't settle. He had seen violence born of anger, fear, desperation. This was different. This was tidy. Across the city, a man bought a newspaper and smiled faintly. Not at the article, it was disappointingly brief, but at what it implied. How quickly the city moved on. How easily a life could be folded into a paragraph and forgotten. He tore the page out and placed it on his table, smoothing the creases. Outside, the fog thickened, rolling through Whitechapel like a living thing, blurring edges, softening guilt. The streets resumed their rhythm. Footsteps. Voices. Doors opening and closing. By nightfall, another woman would walk those same stones, unaware that the city had already decided how little she was worth. And somewhere nearby, someone was already thinking ahead. Because the first body is never the message. It's the test. Chapter 5, ink, paper, and a laugh between the lines. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Tuesdays were honest like that. No false drama. No expectations. Just the quiet certainty that something unpleasant could happen and no one would be surprised. The clerk at the newspaper office slid it open without looking at the return address. Most envelopes were complaints. Some were threats. A few were prayers disguised as ink. This one smelled faintly of soap. Cheap soap. The kind used in boarding houses and rented rooms. The paper was ordinary, folded with care. No haste. No trembling hands. Whoever wrote it had taken his time, which was unsettling in a way no profanity ever could be. The clerk read the first line and frowned. Then he read it again. By the third time, his mouth had gone dry. He carried the letter down the corridor as if it might stain his fingers. The editor took it with a sigh, expecting nonsense, and ended up staring at the page far longer than professionalism allowed. The handwriting was neat. Almost polite. Slanted slightly to the right, confident without being flamboyant. It did not beg for attention. It assumed it. The words danced just enough to suggest amusement. A confession, of sorts. A taunt, more accurately. The writer spoke of the murders with an intimacy that felt invasive, as though he were rearranging furniture in someone else's grief. He mocked the police gently, like an adult humoring a child. He signed it with a name that sounded theatrical, almost playful. A joke. A signature. A mask. The editor laughed despite himself. It slipped out before he could stop it, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. Not because it was funny, but because the audacity was almost admirable. London loved confidence. Even criminal confidence. They argued for an hour about whether to print it. One man insisted it would cause panic. Another said panic sold papers. A third worried about encouraging imitators, as if Whitechapel needed help producing violence. In the end, commerce won. It always did. They published excerpts. By noon, the city had a new obsession. Men read the letter aloud in pubs, exaggerating the tone, turning menace into performance. Someone gave the killer a nickname before the ink was dry, rolling it around their tongue like a clever invention. It stuck immediately. Catchy. Memorable. Perfect for headlines. The irony was delicious. The women who had died were still struggling to keep their names straight in the reports, but the men who killed them now had branding. The police reacted poorly. Meetings were called. Tempers flared. Desks were slammed. Orders were given that contradicted each other. Patrols increased, mostly in visible places where fear could be seen to be addressed. Whistles blew more often. Boots walked louder. None of it mattered. The letter had already done its work. It suggested intelligence. Control. A sense of humor sharpened to a point. This was not a brute swinging blindly in the dark. This was someone enjoying the conversation. Someone who understood that attention was a currency more intoxicating than blood. A senior officer crumpled the paper in his fist. "He's playing with us," he said. "Yes," the doctor replied quietly. "And we're playing along." Across town, in a modest room with curtains drawn tight, a man unfolded the newspaper and scanned the column. His eyes lingered on the printed words, transformed now, cleaned up, contextualized, safely framed. He felt a flicker of disappointment. They had edited it. Softened the edges. Removed the better jokes. Institutions had no taste. Still, the essence remained. The city was listening. That was what mattered. He poured himself a drink and raised it toward the page. "To literacy," he murmured. Outside, London buzzed with speculation. Was the letter real? Was it a hoax? Was the killer educated? Foreign? A gentleman slumming it for thrills? Everyone had a theory. Theories were comforting. They implied that chaos followed rules. What no one discussed was the laughter threaded through the ink. The subtle delight of a man who had discovered not only how to kill, but how to be heard. Because murder, he seemed to understand, was fleeting. Stories were forever. And now the story belonged to him. The city had given him a voice. And voices, once heard, rarely choose to be silent. Chapter 6, Men Who Chased Shadows. They gathered around the table like mourners who had forgotten who they were burying. Inspectors in rumpled coats. sergeants with ink-stained fingers, a doctor whose eyes had not slept properly in weeks. The room smelled of damp wool, tobacco, and frustration. Papers were spread out in untidy stacks, maps of Whitechapel, witness statements, copies of the letter handled so often the edges had softened. No one sat comfortably. The inspector at the head of the table rubbed his temples. His hairline had begun retreating years ago, long before this case, but now it seemed to be fleeing with purpose. He stared at the map as if it might confess out of pity. "We're chasing smoke," he said finally. "Every lead disappears the moment we touch it." "Because there are too many leads," another man snapped. "Everyone's seen something. Everyone's sure." They went through them one by one. A man in a dark coat seen near the alley. A foreign sailor with a temper. A butcher who worked odd hours and kept to himself. A doctor who knew anatomy too well. Each suspect bloomed briefly, full of promise, then withered under scrutiny. Alibis appeared. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Faces blurred. The city produced lies as efficiently as it produced fog. The doctor cleared his throat. "There's consistency," he said. "In the wounds. In the timing. He's learning. Adjusting." One of the inspectors scoffed. "You make it sound like a trade." "It is," the doctor replied. "Or a craft." That word hung in the air, unwelcome. They did not want a craftsman. They wanted a drunk. A madman. Someone who could be dismissed, locked away, explained. A professional suggested planning. Discipline. Patience. It suggested that the city was being studied. Outside the station, the public demanded answers with the righteous impatience of people who did not plan to provide any. Letters flooded in. Tips. Accusations. Crank theories written in furious ink. Some signed with real names. Many did not. Fear had made everyone a detective. Patrols doubled, then tripled. Officers walked the same streets again and again, boots striking stone with theatrical determination. Whistles were kept at the ready. Batons felt heavier in the hand, as if responsibility had weight. And yet the murders continued. Each new body arrived with cruel punctuality, undoing whatever confidence had been stitched together since the last. The newspapers feasted. Headlines grew bolder. Illustrations darker. The killer's name grew larger with each printing, until it nearly eclipsed the victims entirely. Inside the station, tempers frayed. Two inspectors shouted over jurisdiction until their faces reddened. One slammed a drawer so hard it split. Another drank from his flask without pretending it was medicinal. Careers began to bend under the pressure. Promotions stalled. Blame searched for a place to land. Someone suggested bringing in outside help. Someone else laughed. Pride was another obstacle. The Metropolitan Police did not ask for help. Not from the public. Not from rival departments. Certainly not from amateurs with theories and too much time. Yet even pride could not explain the missing evidence. A scrap of cloth logged, then lost. A witness statement misfiled. A suspect released quietly, paperwork incomplete. Mistakes, officially. But mistakes have patterns too. The doctor noticed it first. Not the errors themselves, but their direction. Always reducing complexity. Always simplifying. As if the case were being trimmed down, made smaller, more manageable. As if someone wanted it that way. He mentioned it once, carefully. The room went quiet. No one liked what that implied. Corruption was an uglier thought than incompetence. It suggested intent. And intent, they were learning, was the theme of the season. Late one night, the inspector stayed behind alone. He stood by the window, watching fog swallow the street lamp outside. The glass reflected his face back at him, older than he remembered, harder. He thought of the women. Of the letters. Of the laughter between the lines. "Where are you?" he whispered, unsure who he was speaking to. The answer, of course, was nowhere useful. Because the men they were hunting did not exist the way criminals were supposed to. He left no trail that pointed inward. Only ripples. Only effects. He was a negative space. And somewhere in the city, not hiding but blending, a man read about the investigation and shook his head gently. They were looking for footsteps. He had made sure to leave only echoes. And echoes, by their nature, always arrive too late. Chapter 7, The Anatomy of Fear. Fear did not arrive all at once. It seeped in, slow and methodical, like damp through brick. It settled into joints and habits, reshaping the city in small, almost polite ways. London did not scream. London adjusted. Women stopped walking alone. At first it was casual, 2 figures instead of 1, shared jokes to mask shared nerves. Then it became strategy. Routes were planned. Landmarks memorized. Corners avoided. Some paid for beds they could barely afford just to avoid the walk home. Others stayed out all night, reasoning, correctly, that dawn was safer than sleep. Men noticed, and misunderstood. Some offered protection with a hand that lingered too long. Some took offense, as if fear were a personal accusation. A few enjoyed it. Power had a way of revealing itself when the lights dimmed. The streets themselves seemed to tighten. Markets closed earlier. Pub doors shut with finality instead of invitation. The usual noise of Whitechapel, the arguments, the singing, the chaos, flattened into something watchful. Even laughter sounded rehearsed, as if everyone had forgotten how to do it naturally. The police walked more. They were visible now. Present. Their uniforms brushed clean, their boots polished. It was a performance, and the city understood the script. Authority must be seen, even when it was ineffective. Especially then. Whistles cut through the night like nervous birds. Each one sent a jolt through the chest. Each one promised help that often arrived too late to matter. People learned to listen not for the sound itself, but for what followed. Shouts. Running. Silence. Silence was the worst. The murders grew bolder. Not in spectacle, but in confidence. The locations shifted slightly. The timing changed. It was as if the killer were testing the edges of the map, pressing where resistance thinned. The doctor noticed it immediately. So did the journalists, though they pretended not to. Patterns emerged, then dissolved. The wounds told a story no one wanted to read aloud. Clean lines. Purposeful hands. Someone who understood the body not as a mystery, but as a mechanism. There was economy in the violence. No wasted motion. No hesitation. It suggested rehearsal. Rumors followed anatomy. People whispered about medical training, about slaughterhouses, about men who wore blood for a living and washed it off before supper. The word professional slipped into conversation, then stayed there, heavy and uncomfortable. The irony was almost funny. London trusted professionals. Doctors. Gentlemen. Men with credentials and clean collars. Civilization rested on the assumption that those who understood the body would protect it. Fear, it turned out, had excellent timing. Inside the station, the doctor spread his notes again, aligning sketches and descriptions like pieces of a puzzle that refused to become reassuring. He felt a familiar unease, the sense that the answer was already present, just unwelcome. "He's not escalating," he said quietly to the inspector. "He's refining." The inspector stared at the wall. "That's worse." "Yes," the doctor replied. "Much worse." Outside, the newspapers fed the hunger they claimed to condemn. Diagrams appeared. Maps with black marks. Speculation framed as analysis. Fear sold better when it looked informed. The killer's name appeared in larger type than ever before. Children whispered it like a dare. Men joked about it to prove they weren't afraid. Women flinched when they heard it spoken too casually. Names had power. Everyone knew that. The city had learned it the hard way. In a rented room overlooking a narrow street, a man listened to footsteps pass below his window. He counted them without thinking. 1, 2, 3. A pause. A quickened pace. Someone looking over their shoulder. He smiled, not because he enjoyed the fear, he found it crude, but because it confirmed his hypothesis. Pressure changed behavior. Behavior revealed truth. This was, in its own way, research. He made a note. Literal this time. Ink on paper, pressed firmly. Fear, he understood, was anatomy too. Muscles tightened. Breathing shortened. Decisions narrowed. People became predictable when frightened. The city, vast and complex by day, grew simple at night. And simplicity was a gift. Because while everyone was busy locking doors and holding their breath, they missed the quiet detail that mattered most. The killer was not hiding from fear. He was using it. And the city, in its desperation, was doing most of the work for him. Chapter 8, Doctors, Butchers, and Respectable Monsters. Suspicion, once unleashed, refused to stay polite. It spilled into drawing rooms and back alleys alike, staining reputations with the same enthusiasm it once reserved for aprons and cobblestones. London had decided that if it could not find the killer, it would at least enjoy accusing him. The list of suspects grew absurdly long. Butchers were watched first. Men who worked with blades and blood, who rose before dawn and returned home smelling of iron and fat. Customers studied their hands now, imagining other uses for practiced cuts. A few lost business. One was beaten in the street after someone decided his silence was guilt. He survived. His reputation did not. Doctors followed. Anatomy was suddenly suspicious. Knowledge became a liability. Men who healed by day found themselves avoided by night, their clean coats no longer reassuring. Newspapers hinted darkly at medical expertise, at curiosity taken too far, at science unmoored from morality. One surgeon's name appeared twice in a week. Both times it was spelled wrong. He left the city soon after, not because he was guilty, but because it had become clear that innocence was irrelevant. London needed answers, and it was willing to accept substitutes. Then came the respectable monsters. Gentlemen with money. Gentlemen with titles. Gentlemen who moved easily between Whitechapel and drawing rooms where the air smelled of polish and denial. These rumors were shared in whispers, as if speaking too loudly might invite consequences. It was thrilling, in a dangerous way, to imagine evil wearing a tailored coat. It made for better conversation than the truth, which was that evil usually wore whatever was available. The police chased each lead dutifully, then quietly let it die. Evidence evaporated. Witnesses forgot. Alibis solidified with remarkable speed when accompanied by the right signatures. Some doors, it turned out, were not meant to be knocked on too hard. The inspector noticed the pattern but pretended not to. He had learned, over the years, that careers had skeletons too. You didn't dig unless you were prepared to be buried with them. Justice was an ideal. Employment was a reality. Black humor crept in where despair couldn't reach. If he's a doctor, at least he's thorough, one officer muttered after a long night. Laughter followed, brittle and short-lived. Jokes like that were pressure valves. Without them, something worse might escape. The doctor said nothing. He had begun to understand that the truth was not hiding behind a single door. It was spread thin, diluted across a city that had mastered the art of not looking too closely. The killer wasn't protected by brilliance alone. He was protected by structure. By class. By chaos. By the convenient assumption that monsters always look like monsters. Outside the station, vigilante groups formed and dissolved just as quickly. Armed with sticks and certainty, they patrolled streets they barely understood, mistaking exhaustion for courage. They frightened women, provoked fights, and accomplished nothing measurable. Fear was no longer contained. It ricocheted. In one lodging house, a man was dragged from his bed because someone didn't like the way he walked. In another, a foreign accent was enough to earn a beating. Violence had found new excuses, and it used them enthusiastically. The irony was sharp enough to cut. The city, desperate to stop a killer, was producing more violence than he ever could alone. Late one evening, the inspector received a tip he couldn't ignore. A man. Well-spoken. Kept odd hours. Lived near the murders. It was promising. Too promising. They brought him in quietly. He answered every question calmly, almost kindly. His clothes were neat. His hands clean. He seemed faintly amused by the process, as if enjoying a puzzle with a known solution. After an hour, the inspector felt the uncomfortable sensation of being evaluated. "You've nothing to hold me on," the man said gently. He was right. The paperwork stalled. The interview ended. Apologies were exchanged. The man left, coat buttoned, hat settled just so. No one followed him. The doctor watched from the doorway, a chill crawling up his spine. There was something familiar about the way the man walked away, not hurried, not relieved. Measured. As if he had merely completed an errand. As if the city were exactly as predictable as he'd expected. That night, another letter was rumored. Not sent. Not received. Just spoken of. London was chasing faces now, not ideas. Professions, not patterns. It was easier that way. Safer. Because the most unsettling possibility of all was this. What if the killer wasn't hiding behind respectability? What if he was simply benefiting from it? And what if the city, in its hunger for a villain, was working very hard to make sure he never had to be found? Chapter 9, the night everything went wrong. The rain started just after midnight, thin at first, then heavier, as if the sky had reconsidered and decided not to be subtle. Whitechapel retreated inward. Windows closed. Doors bolted. The streets emptied with unnatural speed, the way they did when fear had learned the schedule. Only the desperate and the careless remained, and the city had never bothered to tell the difference between the two. She should not have been alone. Every instinct she had told her that. Every whispered warning, every story traded over cheap gin, every scream she had pretended not to hear in the past weeks. But instinct did not pay for beds, and fear did not fill an empty stomach. She walked fast, head down, boots slipping slightly on the wet stones. Behind her, the city listened. The encounter was brief. Too brief for heroics. Too brief for the kind of drama people like to imagine later. There was no chase. No grand struggle. Just a wrong turn, a shadow stepping forward, and the sudden, horrifying realization that all the precautions in the world meant nothing when the moment finally chose you. This time, the violence did not hide. It announced itself. A scream tore through the rain, sharp and unmistakable. Not the muted cry of resignation, but pure terror, raw, furious, alive. Windows flew open. Someone shouted. Footsteps followed, then more. The street erupted in chaos, sound colliding with sound. For the first time, the city arrived too early. When the police burst into the street, batons raised, whistles shrieking, the scene was still warm. Too warm. Blood mixed with rainwater, running in rivulets toward the drains. A crowd pressed in, ignoring orders, faces twisted with a mixture of horror and something dangerously close to excitement. They had caught the aftermath in motion. The inspector pushed forward, heart hammering, mind racing through possibilities he had trained himself not to hope for. This was it. This had to be it. Witnesses. Timing. Proximity. But the alley was already empty. No fleeing figure. No discarded weapon. Only the body and the noise. Anger replaced fear with astonishing speed. Someone pointed. Someone accused. Someone grabbed a man who happened to be standing too close, his coat stained with rain and nothing else. He protested, then stopped when the first blow landed. The crowd surged, righteous and blind. It took 3 officers to pull him free. Animals, someone spat. It was unclear who they meant. Inside the station, the pressure reached its breaking point. The superintendent demanded results. The mayor demanded reassurance. The newspapers demanded access. Everyone demanded certainty from men who no longer trusted their own conclusions. Maps were redrawn. Timelines rewritten. Statements taken again and again until they contradicted themselves out of exhaustion. The doctor worked silently, his hands steady, his face closed. This one was different. Not in cruelty, that had reached its limit long ago, but in exposure. The killer had taken a risk. Or something had forced his hand. Either way, the careful rhythm had been broken. The inspector felt it in his bones. He made a mistake, he said. The doctor did not look up. Or the city did. Another letter arrived before dawn. Shorter. Sharper. Less playful. No jokes this time. Just a reminder that control was an illusion, and that panic made fools of everyone eventually. The handwriting was tighter, the pressure uneven. Something had shifted. Not fear, something closer to irritation. The newspapers lost what little restraint they had left. Headlines screamed. Illustrations bordered on fantasy. The killer was no longer a man but an idea, inflated to mythic proportions. The city devoured the story hungrily, even as it pretended to choke on it. And then, just as suddenly as it had escalated, everything stopped. No new body the next night. None the night after. The patrols marched on. The whistles blew. The city held its breath, waiting for the next strike that never came. Silence descended, heavy and suspicious. The inspector stared at the empty board where new evidence should have been. This was not relief. This was something worse. Because chaos was easier to understand than restraint. Violence made sense to a city that had built itself around it. But restraint suggested choice. And choice suggested that whatever had gone wrong that night had not broken the killer. It had satisfied him. Somewhere, unseen and unremarked, a man folded a newspaper and set it aside. He had learned what he needed to learn. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 10, Silence Louder Than Screams. Weeks passed, then months. Whitechapel's nights grew quieter, but not safe. The streets still smelled of coal and damp, still held the echo of boots that no longer came. People walked a little faster, held their scarves tighter, glanced over shoulders even when there was nothing to see. Fear had embedded itself in the rhythm of life, like smoke in hair or soot in lungs. The murders had stopped. Officially. Unofficially, the city whispered. Rumors spread like wildfire, claims of new sightings, strange shadows in alleys, fleeting glimpses of a man in a dark coat who moved too calmly for someone who belonged anywhere. But there were no more letters. No new signatures. No messages. The city, accustomed to chaos, struggled with restraint. The inspector tried to close the case. His reports became careful exercises in minimalism. No further leads, he wrote, suspect unknown, investigation ongoing. He did not mention the fear that still clung to his collar, nor the hollow sensation when he walked alone at night. Newspapers moved on. The sensationalized headlines receded. Society demanded a villain, and when the villain disappeared, the need was filled with gossip, politics, or scandal elsewhere. The doctor continued to study his notes, alone in the dim light of his office. He traced the incisions on maps, memorized the timing, the sequence, the eerie precision. Patterns existed, they always had, but they were now useless. The killer had vanished, leaving only silence and the residue of terror. Whitechapel adapted. Life continued. Women walked in pairs, men no longer lingered in alleyways. Fear became habit, and habit became normal. Yet something remained, unspoken and unresolved. A man in a modest room, curtains tightly drawn, poured himself a glass of whiskey. He listened to the city outside, its breathing, its coughing, its persistent, indifferent hum. He smiled faintly, though no one would ever know. He had disappeared as deliberately as he had appeared. The city had learned too much about itself. About its vulnerability. About the fragility of its order. And in the absence of violence, the echo of it was stronger than ever. Because silence, in a city that expects screams, speaks louder than any noise. The inspector, years later, would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, imagining the quiet of Whitechapel broken again, wondering if the men had simply returned to watch. The doctor would sometimes trace imaginary cuts in the air with his fingers, remembering the precision, the patience, the audacity. Everyone paid a price, even if they did not know it. And the killer? He was already gone. And the city, forever changed, was left to wonder if he had ever existed at all, or if he had been nothing more than the shadow of its own fear, walking just out of reach. Chapter 11, The Price Everyone Paid. The city had survived, but it was not unscathed. Families carried scars invisible to the eye. Women who had lived through the nights could not return to old routines. Their footsteps were careful, measured, hesitant. Doors bolted more than necessary. Sleep came in short bursts, always interrupted by imagined shadows. Men who had once mocked fear now carried it like a secret wound. Every creaking floorboard, every whisper of wind, reminded them of what they had failed to prevent. Pride had cost them their peace. Careers had bent under pressure, reputations tarnished by suspicion or inaction. Even the newspapers suffered, though they called it progress. The thrill of the story faded into history. Front-page excitement replaced by advertisements and politics. Readers moved on, but memory lingered, ink-stained and persistent. Those who had survived the terror, who had walked the streets with one eye on the shadows, understood a truth no one wanted to admit: knowledge can be heavier than grief. They had seen how easily innocence could be erased. They had seen how quickly a city could normalize violence, how rapidly attention could shift from victims to headlines. The inspector grew older, a permanent crease between his eyes. His hands, once steady, trembled slightly in the dark, as if still trying to trace the path of a phantom. He knew he had done everything he could, but everything was never enough. The doctor, meticulous and reserved, understood a different price. He had seen anatomy stripped of meaning, bodies treated like tools in an experiment whose parameters no one could define. He had studied precision and intent, learned its cruel poetry, and knew the lesson would remain with him, quietly, forever. The city itself had paid. Whitechapel's rhythm had changed. Even years later, the night whispered differently. Shadows moved more deliberately. Alleyways seemed narrower. Fear had become a habit, an inheritance. And yet, the killer was absent. No one could claim victory. Northwest One could close the book completely. The newspapers published obituaries, the police wrote reports, families tried to move on, but the true cost was invisible. It was in the quiet footsteps on wet cobblestones, in the hesitant glance over a shoulder, in the knowledge that the worst violence had left no trace except in memory. Black humor lingered in whispered commentary. The city had survived a meticulous murderer and yet managed to make more monsters of itself in panic and suspicion than the killer ever could. London had discovered something fundamental: fear is contagious. Justice is fragile. Truth is often irrelevant. And those who lived through it carried that knowledge like a shadow, walking just behind them, whispering, "Remember." Because the true price of these nights was not counted in bodies. It was measured in the permanent reshaping of lives, the subtle erosion of innocence, and the realization that the world is far less just than anyone hopes. No one had won. Everyone had lost. And the men who had caused it all? Already a legend. Already gone. The streets waited. The city whispered. And life, stubborn and relentless, carried on. Chapter 12, The Philosophy of a Shadow. Time passed, but it did not heal. Decades later, Whitechapel remained haunted, not by the bodies left behind, but by the knowledge that someone had walked through it deliberately, observing, calculating, shaping fear like a craftsman shapes clay. The fog still rolled in thick layers, the cobblestones still glistened with rain, but now every shadow seemed to hold intent. Every creaking door hinted at secrets no one dared uncover. The killer had vanished, but his lessons remained. That terror is more efficient than law. That society often protects its own illusions rather than its people. That those who watch silently, carefully, always have the upper hand. Somewhere, in a modest room far from the alleys, a man sipped whiskey and read about a city still trying to make sense of its own fear. He smiled faintly. Not with malice, exactly, but with recognition. Humans are predictable, he noted. Emotion governs more than reason. Panic spreads faster than order. History repeats itself because it is rarely learned. The irony, always present, was delicious. A city consumed by progress, empire, and morality had been undone not by armies or revolution, but by subtlety, patience, and audacity. He had not killed for hatred. He had not killed for attention. He had killed to teach a lesson the city would never forget. And it had learned. The inspector, long since retired, would sometimes recall the smell of rain on cobblestones, the sound of gas lamps flickering, the way a scream could stretch thin and linger. He would shiver, even decades later, not out of fear of death, but out of the memory of being helpless in a city unwilling to see. The doctor, older now, wiser in ways the world never acknowledged, traced the lines of anatomy and violence in his mind, understanding fully that evil was neither random nor chaotic, it was precise. It was philosophy enacted with a blade. The women, whose lives had been stolen, remained stories whispered in margins, footnotes in newspapers, ghosts in the alleyways. The city had moved on publicly, but privately it never did. Each step in Whitechapel was a reminder of what had passed, what had been orchestrated, and what could happen again. And the killer? He existed only as a shadow now. A whisper of intent. A lesson written in fear and precision, never to be solved. Sometimes truth disappears with the people who knew it. Sometimes, fear lasts longer than memory. Sometimes, the city itself becomes the teacher, and everyone who survives is the student. He poured the last of his whiskey, set the glass down, and listened to the distant hum of London. Quiet. Predictable. Deceptive. Because he had learned what the city would never admit aloud, the real terror was not in the hand that wielded the knife. It was in the mind that saw, and understood, and waited. And that mind was already gone. Whitechapel exhaled. The fog rolled in again, thick and patient. The alley swallowed the echoes of history, but the lessons remained. Sometimes, truth disappears. Sometimes, fear is eternal. And sometimes, the city itself whispers your name. The end.